Hey, welcome to Page Break. I'm your host, Brian McClellan, coming to you from a post-Thanksgiving overeating stupor here in the mountains of Utah. A brief bit of housekeeping. Thanks again to everyone who came out to Brandon Sanderson's Dragonsteel Con. I met tons of Page Break listeners and people from my street team, which was very cool. With any luck, they'll invite me back next year, and I'll get to see even more of you. The Montego Kickstarter is going fantastically. We crossed 300% of the goal last week, making this my most successful Kickstarter to date, both in number of supporters and amount of money. For those of you who haven't gotten behind it yet, we now have maps signed by Ben McSweeney, my interior artist for Glass Immortals. There are also a few Tuckerization levels left for anyone who wants to get their name in the next book. Now, on with the show! My guest this week is New York Times bestselling author and wargame blogger Robison Wells. Rob is known for his breakout young adult suspense novel Variant and its sequel Feedback, as well as a number of other science fiction and fantasy novels. He also co-wrote The Warning with James Patterson, and now runs a popular wargame hobby website, The Wargame Explorer. Rob and I chat at length about the wargaming industry and its various quirks and foibles. We touch on Rob's struggle to maintain his writing career with schizophrenia, and how much painting miniatures has helped him maintain and regulate his creative side. Enjoy my conversation with Robison Wells. So, man, how has the painting been going?
The painting is going good. I'm in a little bit of a funk right now. Nothing is really catching my fancy. I've got this thing going on, which you've probably followed if you follow me on Twitter, called the Hobby Streak.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, where I paint every day for at least 30 minutes, and then I post the results on social media. And the whole point is to not show off like I'm so fantastic, but to show off like it's like forming good habits. And creating good habits. Today was day 536 of in a row, so I'm pretty stoked about that.
Yeah.
But I'm also in kind of a burnout phase where I'm like, I'll paint a little bit, but I'm not really into it today, and I need to find something to jumpstart me, and so I'm not sure what it is.
When you say that nothing is catching your eye, do you look at these things? Because miniatures is something that's very outside of my kind of realm of experience. Because every time I've tried to either paint or play a game with miniatures, I always get super intimidated. But I was curious, what exactly is it that kind of gets you going when you look at a new mini?
There are a lot of things. Sometimes it's just the mini is really cool and intricate and looks like it's going to be a big challenge. And that's a good example. Some of the bigger stuff, I don't know if your audience knows wargaming at all, but like Warhammer Age of Sigmar, I've recently been into painting Sylvaneth, they're kind of wood elves, but they're kind of like trees come to life, kind of Ents, but kind of elves. They're weird. But I've been painting those, and those have been like really intricate and detailed, but at the same time, I got into another game called Conquest, The Last Argument of Kings, which is, I got into that on purpose because the scale is probably twice the size of a regular miniature, and so they're so much easier to paint.
Yeah.
And it's like painting on easy mode, and so it really depends. A lot of the time, because I'm running my blog about wargaming, I will pick up miniatures that I want to review for the site. Like there's a game like this Conquest, Last Argument of Kings. I got them so that I could review them for the site. The same thing with A Song of Ice and Fire. They have a miniatures game, and I just reviewed that for the site. And so I've been painting those miniatures. There are some that are passion projects for me. Like Warhammer 40K is relaunching after 30 years of writing them out of the lore. They're relaunching their squats, which are space dwarves. And that's what I got started on 30 years ago. Here I am, 44. I got started in those probably when I was 12, bought my first box, and was just hooked on them. And then after, I think during second edition of Warhammer 40K, they wrote them out of the lore, and they wrote them out saying they were completely wiped out and destroyed and they don't exist anymore. But there's always been this undercurrent in the fan community saying, bring back the squats, bring back the squats. And this year they're finally doing it. And so I have some, I mean, right here in front of me, squat models that I have been painting, and it just thrills me. It brings me back to when I was 12.
Yeah.
And so that's stuff that I love. So it's stuff that I love. It's stuff that I feel obligated to review, and a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm. What makes a bad miniature? I'm kind of curious now.
For me, a lot of it is bad detail, which generally comes from bad plastic and bad molding.
Mm-hmm.
I really like miniatures that I consider bad, and I apologize to anyone who loves them. I think all the D&D miniatures are bad. They're made out of this crappy plastic that doesn't hold detail well. So when you paint them, you're not sure, is this like a belt loop? Is this a bag on the belt? Is this the hilt of the sword? Like, you can't tell what stuff is. And the metal is kind of, not the metal, the plastic is a little flimsy, and I hate the D&D miniatures. And some of the others, Reaper used to be that same way, where they had this really crappy plastic and the paint didn't even adhere to it very well. So it depends. I buy so many miniatures.
Yeah.
I have shelves and shelves of miniatures. And when I get stuff like that, that I get for reviewing stuff for the site, I will almost always paint enough that I can review them, and then I will give the rest to my 13-year-old son, who loves them, and he will paint anything.
Yeah.
He doesn't care what it is, and he will paint them in all sorts of bright colors, and so they all get used, but I don't necessarily love them all.
Now, have you been painting for that long, or just into the wargaming that long?
I took a break. So I got started in wargaming when I was 9,
mm-hmm.
and there's a magazine called Wargames Illustrated that comes out of the UK, and it is primarily historical wargaming. And somehow, and I don't know how, but 4 copies of this magazine ended up in the house. And I think my dad maybe brought them home from work, because my dad's a fantasy guy. He read us The Lord of the Rings when I was about that age, and somehow these copies of Wargames Illustrated ended up in the house. And there was a rule set that was a single page for playing a Vietnam war game. And I was just blown away. Like, all I needed were my little green army men, which I had, and here were a page of rules that a 9-year-old could understand. And you didn't need to buy source books, and you didn't need to buy hardback books, and you didn't need anything. You just needed this magazine. And so I painted up little green army men, some of them blue, and some of them with blue helmets, some of them with black helmets. And I would play this Vietnam Army game for years. And then I got into my first Games Workshop miniatures. When I was probably about 11, I bought some skeletons. And then when I was 12, I bought these squats. And I painted on and off throughout high school. And then in the early days of my marriage, I painted a lot, quite extensively. I had a whole room dedicated to it. And my brother, who's also been a guest on your podcast, Dan Wells, mm-hmm. He was into it too. And every Thursday, I remember, I would drive down. I live in Salt Lake City. He lives in Provo, or he did at the time. And I would drive down every Thursday, and we would play Warhammer 40K all day on Thursday. And but I remember very distinctly when we were, what year would this have been? Probably about 2004, 2005. We went on a family vacation to a nice condo up one of the canyons, and I brought all my Warhammer stuff. He brought all his Warhammer stuff, and we said, we are going to play, and it'll be fun. We've got a whole weekend, or I think it was a whole week at this condo. And what we didn't realize is that at that condo, we discovered that his oldest kid was able to reach the table and take models off the table. And that was the last war game that he and I ever played for about 15 years.
Oh.
It just immediately like, uh-oh, kids are involved. It's over.
Yeah.
So I took a break for a long time from it, and I got back into it a little bit. When my first book was published, Dan actually gave me a starter set the night that I was having my book launch for my first nationally published book, Variant. Dan gave me a starter set for Privateer Press's game War Machine. And he and Howard Taylor were getting really into War Machine and some other guys. And so I got that and I started to paint again, and then I just fell into it. I had book money coming in, and it was good book money. And I'm like, this is no longer an unaffordable hobby, because miniatures is kind of an unaffordable hobby. But I could afford it. And so I was buying a lot of miniatures. I was painting a lot of miniatures, and I've just been hooked ever since. So that was probably 2010, and I've been doing it pretty steadily since then. But then it took a major upswing about 3 years ago when I decided that I was going to get into, I don't know what the decision was. I just decided that I was going to get into it more seriously.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it was that there has been this massive boom in online, especially YouTube, wargaming channels. And there's so much content put out, battle reports and painting tutorials and terrain tutorials and lore videos where they just talk about the history of the orcs and I think that I fell into it on YouTube, and I'm like, I really want to get back into this, and I've got a good job now. I can afford it again, because there was a little while that I couldn't, and ever since then, I dove into it, and then I decided to make it into a profitable side career.
Well, and I was a bit curious about that, because I know you've tweeted about this a little bit. Is the blog, because you've got the Wargaming Explorer, is it something that brings in an income?
It does. It has been growing like crazy. I started it March 2nd or May 2nd of 2021. This last month, so July, we broke 70,000 page views in a month.
Well, dang.
Yeah, so it's growing pretty fast. And I get paid in basically two ways: ad revenue and in affiliate marketing. So in affiliate marketing is if I do a product review and I say, hey, this is a really cool space dwarf, you should buy this. And I put a link to usually Amazon, but I also have an affiliate in the UK, because about a third of my readership is in the UK.
Yeah.
Europe is so much bigger for wargaming than the US is. And I, at this point, I'm making probably about enough to pay my car payment every month.
That's not nothing.
No, it's not. And the nice thing is that it's growing every single month. Like, I run the numbers on the first of every month, and every month is a record-breaking month. And so it's only going up, and I'm loving it, and it's fun. So
that's very cool. I was curious how you think, as someone who has been involved on some levels for decades with this hobby, how has it changed with kind of the advent of kind of the print on demand and, home 3D printers, things like that. Is that changing the hobby at all?
Oh, yeah, dramatically. Yes. I have a 3D printer, but I've got a filament printer.
Mm-hmm.
There are two kinds of printers. There's filament printers and resin printers. And filament printers are good for big stuff, like terrain pieces. I've printed off big churches and farmhouses and those kind of things on this filament printer to use as scenery. But resin printers, you can have miniatures that have every bit as much crispness and fidelity as anything that you would get from any game company, assuming that you find the right seller, because there's a lot of garbage out there too. There's a lot of 3D printing files that aren't very good, but you can find some just gorgeous stuff. And the big question on everyone's lips is this going to kill the big game companies? Because as 3D printers get better and better and cheaper, the reason I don't have one is because the apartment I live in, I don't have a room with good ventilation.
Yeah.
And resin has an awful smell. And that's getting better. They've improved technology, but I just don't have a place where I would put a resin printer. So everyone is curious as to whether 3D printers are going to collapse the market for Games Workshop, for Mantic, for Wargames Atlantic, for all of these companies that make so much money on miniatures. Because miniatures are frigging expensive.
Yeah. Like
a box of 10 Space Marines is like $60. It's ridiculous. And what I don't think that 3D printing, and of course, making any predictions about the future of technology is just completely stupid.
Right.
But I think when it comes to Games Workshop, which is, the next company that is as close to Games Workshop as possible is, I can't remember the name of the company, Asmodee, who does Star Wars Legion, and they're like a tenth the size of Games Workshop. They're just nowhere compared. Games Workshop dominates because it controls so much intellectual property.
Yeah.
And that is where their money is made. And that's why they can charge such a premium for these things, is because they own the intellectual property. They call it the Black Library, but it's their fiction division where they have something like 400 novels that are just all about their different worlds that they play in. And I don't see that going away anytime soon. And so I don't know if there's going to be a time where Games Workshop starts selling 3D printer files in some kind of, knowing Games Workshop is extremely litigious. They send out cease and desist letters to everybody.
Yeah.
But if there was some way, like with music, how DRM for music, if there was some way that you could lock a 3D printing file so that it's non-transferable,
yeah,
I could see Games Workshop going down that road. But I don't see it for at least 10 years. The thing is that 3D printing is a hobby unto itself. It's not exactly plug and play yet. It's getting better and better, and it's growing really, really fast. But you still need quite a setup. You need a 3D printer, then you need a wash and cleaning station, and then you need a curing station with UV lights, and you need all of this stuff, and you need a bucket of isopropyl alcohol, and it's very elaborate what you need to be able to do resin printing. And I think that until it becomes as easy as, well, I'm just going to spend 20 minutes driving to the game store, pick me up a box of models that I can come home and assemble immediately. Until we reach that point, there's always going to be a market for pre-made miniatures.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I got to imagine that places like Games Workshop they just have the they have the advantage of lots and lots of experience, the advantage of lots and lots of designs that are just there. But I do imagine that there's already people that, I mean, I guess as far as you can pirate those designs without having files, like imitating them and selling them, I imagine that's a thing, right?
It is. And there's two different worlds of that. And one is squeaking by without the cease and desist letters. There's like a great one is Victoria Miniatures, which is a company in Australia. So in Warhammer 40K, there are the Imperial Guard, which are, you've got your Space Marines, which are your superhumans that can take any amount of beating and take down a whole army all by themselves. But then the grunts in the army are the Imperial Guard, and they come from a million different worlds, so they all have different look and aesthetic looks to them. Games Workshop currently only sells 3 different regiments, but this company, Victoria Miniatures in Australia, sells like 8 more that have been mentioned in the lore, so we know what they look like. And they're creating models that look like what Games Workshop has described, but they're not copying anything that Games Workshop has done. So they're able to skate by, and they're selling those, and they do very well. And like these space dwarves, their Wargames Atlantic sold their own space dwarves. Seems like every company has sold space dwarves for the past 20 years because everyone has wanted SWATs to come back. So that kind of stuff exists and doesn't get slapped down. But there was a very prominent wargamer, and I say prominent in the fact that he's like notorious. A lot of people just hate the guy. A YouTuber who's really into 3D printing, but also very much into being a contrarian, hating Games Workshop. And he created some files that were 100% knockoffs of Wargame or Games Workshop miniatures, and they immediately slapped him with the cease and desist, and he had to comply. And so it's a little bit of both. And there are always places where people will fill in the gaps. Like another place where people are filling in the gaps is Warhammer Fantasy used to be dwarves and elves and men and dragons. And then Games Workshop kind of blew that system up and created this whole new fantasy world where everything was a little different. And they did it for a couple of reasons, which we can talk about later if you want. But one of the armies that they had that everyone loved were the Tomb Kings, which were essentially ancient Egyptians. There were mummies and liches, and everything was very Egyptian. And that game doesn't exist anymore. Games Workshop has they've hinted that they're going to bring back that Warhammer Fantasy, but they haven't. And so 3D printers have jumped on that, and they're like, well, if you're not bringing it back, we're bringing it back. And there are a ton of Tomb King models available on 3D printing.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I imagine because it's wargaming is one of those kind of hobbies, and I say this as somebody who knows people that do it, but I've never done it myself. It's one of those hobbies that I think in the mainstream it would be considered quite niche, but it's still large enough to support, stores in lots of different cities and towns and things like that. And there's a lot of love that goes into it. A lot of love, a lot of, sometimes obsession, right?
Yeah.
And so I've got to imagine that it is just, especially with 3D printing, it is just constantly evolving, and lots of, bickering and legal stuff. And there's got to be some, I don't know, sort of comparison that we could make even to, pirating ebooks, right?
Oh, yeah.
But it's a physical thing, which is very interesting to me. That it's like if everybody suddenly could get they could print their own novels in their home kind of really easily, bound novels.
Yeah.
But it is kind of crazy that has jumped forward so much in, I don't know, the last few years even.
Yeah. You know what in your case, I think about your books all the time. I've read your first two Powder Mage books, and there are two game systems that kind of made a splash this year that are Flintlock Fantasy. There's one called Silver Bayonet and another called Sludge, and they're both fantastic games. I reviewed them both on the site, and they're called miniatures agnostic, which means you can use any miniatures you want and just convert them however you want, and they just sell the rule book.
Yeah.
But I keep thinking Powder Mage needs to be snapped up as an IP and turned into a war game. I think it would be phenomenal.
There would be 5 very enthusiastic people playing it, and that would be it. Hey, Page Break listeners, Brian here, rudely interrupting myself for a bit of a plug. Making a podcast isn't free, and I'm hoping that you enjoy it enough to pitch in a pittance. To do so, head on over to patreon.com/pagebreak, where you can toss as little as $3 a month into the tip jar, $5 a month to get the podcast ad-free and early, and $10 a month to hear your name in the credits and feel a smug sense of superiority. You can also buy my books from your favorite retailer, or direct from my website. Thanks to everyone who contributes. Now back to me. It is funny because I do get tagged like a lot of authors. You know, I on Instagram, I follow the hashtags for, you know, like Powder Mage Trilogy, Brian McClellan, you know, things like that. And I get tagged pretty frequently for anybody who does a Flintlock miniature.
Yeah.
And it's always fun to see them pop up, and it's usually somebody else's game and doesn't have anything to do with Powder Mage, but they clearly threw it in because it's Flintlock. But I do love seeing those things painted and looking cool.
Yeah. I think that you could really, I don't know, even just an indie game, I think it would be awesome.
Yeah. That's fun. The thing with those kind of games is that I realized at some point, probably after I did X-Wing for a while, and then I switched over to Armada, Star Wars Armada, and then I collected all the ships when it first came out and the first couple of expansions, and then I realized at some point that I much prefer looking at them than I do actually playing any of the games. And is that a kind of a subset of, you know, painters and collectors in wargaming?
Oh, absolutely. There's a company, and I can't, I feel stupid. I can't remember it's Wargame Strategy and something, but the abbreviation is WSS. But they put out every year, and they just released the new one, the Great Wargaming Survey. And they will gather up, they spread it far and wide and try to get as many people involved in it as possible. And one of the questions they ask is, how often do you play the game? And most gamers who consider themselves gamers play less than once every 2 or 3 months. Miniatures, there are some people who, like, twice a week they're at the game store and they're playing. But so many people are in it for the collecting and the painting and just the community, because there's a great online community. There's a lot of toxic online communities, as there are with anything. There's a great online community for it, and the fun of painting stuff, putting it on the shelf, saying, I did that. With me, because I paint so much, I have had to start flipping a lot of stuff on eBay, where I will paint up some armies and build them up, and then have a big sale, and it helps fund the habit of buying more and more miniatures.
Yeah.
But also, like, I did it a couple months ago where I sold a bunch of stuff for a fundraiser for Save the Children in Ukraine, and we raised almost $2,000 for that, which was pretty fantastic, and it was just selling stuff on eBay. And so there is definitely a culture in wargaming that is all about collecting and painting and doesn't care as much about playing the game. And it's interesting because it goes in cycles and it goes by game. Like Warhammer 40K right now is kind of universally hated. The current edition, it's in ninth edition, and it has a lot of rules bloat. It is very clumsy to play because there's just so many rules. And they're little nitpicky things where unless you memorize every rule book of every army, which you can't possibly do, then your opponent is going to, at some point in the game, say, well, I'm going to spend a command point and I'm going to play this ability. And you're like, I've never heard of that ability in my life. I didn't know you could do that. And it just is driving people bananas. And so I think fewer people are playing 40K. I don't think any fewer people are buying 40K, because I think people will always buy 40K.
Yeah.
And Games Workshop just released their financial report because they're a public company. And they had, once again, they broke their profit records. And so they're doing just fine, even though the game isn't. And we're expecting that the new game will be released sometime next year, the new edition, because Games Workshop is on like a 3-year cycle where every 3 years they'll release a new edition. 8th edition was very pared down and very simplistic, and then it's just kind of rolled out of control. So, yeah, some people don't play just because the rules are bad. Some people go to different things. Well, and something that is worth saying is all this time we've been talking about the big game companies, we've been neglecting an entire arm of wargaming, which is historical wargaming.
Right.
Historical wargaming and sci-fi fantasy wargaming do not mix very well at all. But historical wargaming is huge, especially in Europe.
Yeah.
But also there's a very big group in the eastern United States. They just had their annual event called Historicon, where they got together and they ran a bunch of games. And historical wargaming seems very unaffected because they run on a completely different model where there is no company that dominates anything. You use whatever rules you want, and generally the rules are written by someone in your gaming group, and they can be played at 2mm scale or 15mm scale or whatever scale you want, and it's a completely different world from Games Workshop. And of course, Games Workshop is a company that's worth billions of dollars.
Yeah.
And historical wargaming is not, but historical wargaming is like its own thing that exists and seems immune to all of the drama and all of the no one is 3D printing 2mm historical miniatures. Like, they just, you buy those. Yeah.
Right. Oh, that's fascinating. I wouldn't even have thought to bring up historical wargaming, even though I am aware of it. That's kind of funny comparing it, because I guess I live in kind of fantasy land, right? Because I write fantasy novels. So that's kind of my default, but that is like like historical wargaming. There's what's it? Do they call when they do reenacting? Do they call it LARPing, or do they just call it reenacting?
They call it reenacting
because that's like the equivalent of.
Yeah, if it's sci-fi fantasy, then it's LARPing.
Yeah. Okay.
If it's historical, it's reenacting.
I just thought that seemed like a good comparison. That's very funny.
Yeah.
So how did you go from your kind of career background? Went from, you were a poli-sci major and you got a marketing degree, and then at some point you started writing novels, which, funny enough, because I know you from your science fiction novels, and funny enough, you started off with a romantic comedy. Is that right?
Yeah, my first book was a romantic comedy. I was in a writing group with Dan, my brother, and Brandon Sanderson and a couple other guys. And before any of us were published, and I was writing a fantasy novel because they were all writing fantasy novels. But I didn't read fantasy at the time. And so it was so bad. It was just like, it was the most derivative. It wasn't even like a Tolkien ripoff. It was like I don't know what it was a ripoff of. It was like a ripoff of, like, I don't know. It wasn't good. It was like someone who had heard the words goblin and dwarf and wrote a book about them. And it was really bad. And so I fell back on the advice of write what you know. And I didn't write a story about my own personal romance, but I wrote a story about a town that I lived in, this little town in New Mexico that was full of just quirky, bizarre people. It's just a strange little town. I loved it. It's Grants, New Mexico. I love the town. I lived there for a year and full of fun people. And I just decided to set a book there. And I wrote a romantic comedy. And it got published. It was a small press. So yes, it is my first book, but I don't consider it my first, like, I think I have two careers because I have those 3 books. I published 3 books with that small press. And then I took like 4 years off. And in the meantime, I went to grad school, got my MBA, studied marketing, got a marketing job. And, well, actually, the way that the science fiction happened is that I graduated during the Great Recession. And so when I entered the MBA program, they said that they had a 97% job placement rate at graduation. 97% of people had jobs when they graduated. Mm. And the year that I graduated, it was 43%. Ooh. And just no one had jobs. And so I didn't have anywhere to go. We had spent all our savings on going to grad school, my wife and I, and at that point we had 3 kids. We had a baby that had just been born, and we didn't know where we were going because we didn't have a job yet. We didn't know what city we'd end up in, and so we moved back in with my parents. And here I was 31, 32 at the time, and with 3 kids, moved back in with my parents. And every day my dad had a spare office. And every day I would go in there and I'd spend the first half of the day applying for jobs. And I would spend the second half of the day writing. Mm-hmm. And something clicked at one point. Basically what happened is that Dan came to me and he said, I am going with a group of people to World Fantasy. I was super depressed at the time. Like, I couldn't find a job. Everything was bad. I was defaulting on credit cards. Everything was lousy. And Dan came to me and he's like, I know everything sucks for you right now. He had just been published. He said, I'm going to World Fantasy. If you have a novel to pitch, I will introduce you to all the agents and editors that I know. And I said, okay. But the problem was I didn't have a novel to pitch, and it needed to be either science fiction or fantasy. And I knew I couldn't write fantasy because I tried that once. But at the time, it was a year after Hunger Games had come out. Yeah. And it was the beginning of the rise of the dystopian. And I got an idea for a story. I wrote it in 11 days. That was the other thing. He's saying, I'll pay your way. It's in 2 months, 2 months from now. Yeah. I wrote the book in 11 days. I spent the next 6 weeks revising it. Went to World Fantasy, completely bombed. Didn't get any good contacts from anyone. It was completely lousy, but it had motivated me to write this book. And then after I got home, Dan said, well, why don't you send it to my agent? And so I wrote the world's worst query letter, which was, I mean, they hate me because they spend so much time like going over all the rules of how to write a query letter and all the articles that have been written about this is the proper way to do it. And my query letter was basically, "Hi, I'm Rob. I'm Dan's brother. He said I could send you this. What do you think?" And I sent this book to her, but she loved it and she picked it up, and then it sold in a 3-book deal to HarperCollins, and the rest is history.
Yeah. I understand that you have kind of fallen away from writing in recent years. Is that true, or is that just publicly true? Is your publishing fallen away from?
So here's something that we haven't talked about on the podcast yet today. I have schizophrenia. You know that.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote, my publishing deal was really good, and it expanded from 3 books into 5 books, and I was writing full time, and had a nice house, and everything was going well, and I was falling apart mentally. The schizophrenia came on while I was writing my second book, and it wasn't diagnosed until like 7 years later, but the symptoms were coming on. We didn't know what it was, but everything was going really badly. And it basically got to a point where I couldn't write. I finished the books that I was contracted for, and then my agent is phenomenal. She's just, I mean, and I don't mean that she's like a good agent. She is a good agent, but she's just a good person. And so she understood that I was sick, and she said, "You can't write your own stuff right now, but I'm going to find you write for hire jobs." So I did a lot of write for hire, ghost writing, a lot of YA stuff that was written from about 2015 to 2018, books in that area. I wrote a lot of other people's books, and I really grew to start hating it. And then I got my biggest break, which was a book that was not necessarily write for hire. It was co-written with James Patterson.
Yeah.
So, of course, the biggest author in the world, by like a factor of 10. And I got to write a book with him. It was a miserable experience, and primarily miserable because I was sick.
Yeah.
And I wasn't writing well. But then it came out, and it did better than any book that I've ever written. It hit the New York Times bestseller list, so I got that feather in my cap. And then I never made a conscious decision, but I fell out of love with writing. Like, I mean, you're a writer. That fire in the belly, that, like, I've got a story to tell, and I need to tell this story. I've got so many ideas. Like, I don't have that anymore. Like, I don't feel like I have a book in me that is waiting to come out. I've played around with a couple of ideas, but I think one of the things is that my day job, I've got a terrific day job, where I work for a digital marketing agency, and I write for them. But I tallied it up last year at the end of December last year. In that time, I'm writing web copy and emails and blogs and product descriptions. And I tallied it up that at the end of December in 1 year, I had written 640,000 words of marketing copy.
Yeah.
And I just think, and that's gone down, like the company has realized this is unsustainable. We're killing our writers. But it was during that time where I thought, I'm not enjoying, I don't have the fire in the belly of writing books anymore. But I'm learning so much from this new job about digital marketing. I do have the fire in the belly for wargaming. Let's combine the two, and let's see if I can start a website that uses all of the knowledge that I have gained from this digital marketing agency and see if I could turn that into a living.
Yeah.
And I call it my get rich slow scheme because I've set financial goals for it. But I sincerely believe that if I do it right and if I stick with it, that it will replace my income when it hits the 3-year mark. And right now we're at the 1 year and 3 months mark. But I mean, just based on the metrics and on the growth that we're on, that it will replace the income. And that's phenomenal. And that's kind of what I love. But so I'm not writing a book. I don't have any desire to write a book. One interesting thing, I started to write a memoir because about schizophrenia. And I wrote one chapter, and the day that I wrote the chapter, I'm like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to write a memoir. It's going to be my new thing. And the day that I wrote the first chapter, and I was really proud of it, I had to take a drive to Idaho, and I was in a rollover car accident.
Oh, I didn't realize that was the same day.
It was the same, like I finished the chapter, I got in the car.
Oh my gosh.
And I left, and I had a traumatic brain injury. And so one of the things that's funny with when you get a traumatic brain injury, the doctor tells you need to take it easy. But one of the things they say is don't think too hard.
Oh, man.
Which I didn't even know that you could hurt yourself by thinking too hard. But he's like, don't try to do anything hard. Like, don't read books. Don't do stuff. Don't think too hard. So for 6 weeks, I was completely unable to write the book, the memoir. And then when 6 weeks were done, I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I'm not interested anymore.
Yeah. I think every author has had that experience of starting something that's very exciting to them. And then, hopefully most of us haven't been distracted in such a severe way.
Yeah.
But then life hits them in some way. And then they realize, well, maybe I wasn't as excited about this thing as I thought I was. And that's always so frustrating, kind of looking back and going, wait a second, I thought that I really wanted to do this.
Yeah.
That's crazy. I don't know if this is probing too hard, but with the severe mental illness, was the brain injury, that's got to complicate things, right?
Yeah. So the mental illness, yes, it really did. But it was weird. So I have schizophrenia, and I'm high functioning schizophrenic, and I'm on, about 3 years ago, my doctor put me on a new medicine, which I call my miracle medicine, that I have not, since I've been on this medicine, I have not had a single bout of psychosis. No hallucinations, no delusions. I am stable. I still have a lot of depression. I still have a lot of anxiety. But, and I'll tease your listeners. I have one schizophrenic symptom that is the one that I wrote about in the memoir, and the chapter title of the memoir is The Thing We Don't Talk About. And that's the symptom, and it is the one symptom of schizophrenia that remains, the thing we don't talk about.
Yeah.
Anyway, when I had the traumatic brain injury, I had such just an overwhelming feeling of guilt. And I had spent all of this time, I'd been to psychiatrists for 10 years, and they had worked with me. But this was the first time where I was like breaking down, where I was overwhelmed with guilt. And it was weird because no one else was injured. I was the only person in my car. There were no other cars involved. But I couldn't handle the guilt of this. And I called a helpline not the suicide helpline, but a helpline for mental stuff. And I said, I don't know what to do. And they hooked me up with a therapist. And it was the first time in my life that I'd ever been to a therapist. And he helped me so much. Like, I can't believe that there was a time in my life when I didn't have a therapist. And I am such an advocate now for everybody, regardless of whether you've got a mental illness or not. Everybody ought to have a therapist.
I've had a therapist for about 3 years now, and I mean, everybody has their things, right? But I don't have anything severe. But man, it's just so nice to pay somebody that you can talk to about literally anything. No social barriers. No, is my wife going to get annoyed if I mention this thing? None of that. Like, it's just somebody that you pay to dump on.
Yeah.
And I honestly, I'm also a huge proponent of that. I think it's very mentally healthy.
Yeah, it really helped me. And so since then, I've got 2 of my kids I've got going in to see therapists, and I keep trying to talk my wife into it, but she won't go. But
I was curious if you found that your painting helps you with your illness. And I asked this because, as you know, and I've mentioned occasionally on the podcast that, I'm married to somebody who has severe mental health issues. And she has found over the last few years, especially, that working on artistic projects really helps her stay grounded and helps her not focus on kind of the demons that are going on. And I'm kind of curious if you have found that with art.
Absolutely. Very much. So my situation right now, I'm in kind of a downward, you're always in ups and downs. And currently I'm in a downward trend for depression. And what I have found is that I do my day job and I wake up. One of the things is because of my medicine, I wake up early. I wake up at like 5 a.m. And I wake up at 5 a.m. and I will paint or work on the blog for 3 or 4 hours, and then I'll start my day job. And I work from home on my day job. And I will do my day job, and as soon as I finish the day job, I crash. The depression hits, and I'm just like, everything is awful. I can't do anything today. And in the bad times, I will just get on Twitter and start scrolling. And if no one stops me, I'll just do that for 6 hours and be miserable. But my doctor put me on an increased dose of medicine that I take just before work gets out. That's supposed to help with depression. And I found that if I take that dose of medicine, I will hit a slump. It won't be as bad. And if I can force myself against my will, because I don't want to do it, but if I can force myself against my will to paint, or it's generally to paint, because in the evening I can't write. I do all my writing in the morning. If I force myself to paint, then I will come out of the slump and be fine for the rest of the evening.
Yeah.
And I might just paint for 2 hours, and then I'll spend some time with the family. I have the most understanding wife. And I am impressed with you, because I think that it takes a lot to be the spouse of someone with severe mental challenges. My wife puts up with so much, and she just knows that Rob is probably going to be in the office painting until 7 p.m. and that's how it's going to be. And maybe it'll be till 8 p.m. But that's just the price we pay for having Rob functional. And she's extremely patient, and I don't know how I got so lucky to have such a patient wife.
Well, I'm glad that you are. That's fantastic. I don't know if I have much more to add for that without revealing too much,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was I had something very deep I wanted to ask you, and it's just totally fled my brain. Well, there's so much for that. But I also have realized that I've kept you for over an hour now. I don't want to take up a bunch more of your time. But we always like ending these episodes with a very simple question. What's the last thing that you ate that blew your mind?
All right. So you get two answers here because I listen to your podcast all the time, so I knew this question was coming. So the one answer that is appalling that you shouldn't, like, I was going, like, a week ago, I thought, is this really the answer I'm going to give? And it really was. I have, like you, I have comorbidities that don't like COVID. My wife has comorbidities that don't like COVID. So we don't go out very much. And we went out recently, like the first time that we had ventured out. And I feel so stupid saying this. We went to Olive Garden and I had fettuccine Alfredo. And I was like, oh my gosh, someone has created divinity and put it on a plate. And it was just Olive Garden fettuccine Alfredo. But it was the first thing that I'd eaten at a restaurant in 2.5 years. And so I thought it was so terrific. But my real answer was fortunate this week. My work, I work remote, but there are about 15 of us who live in Utah of the company. And we all had a meetup at an African place. And I don't know the name of it. It was some kind of, I can't remember the first word in it, but it was African sweet corn. And it was this roasted, it was fresh corn, obviously not canned corn. It was fresh corn and it was roasted. And it had this cream, crumbly sauce on it. And it was divine. I don't know what it was, but it was down in Lehi, Utah. And I'm definitely going down there again just to get this sweet corn. It was phenomenal.
That sounds great. I'm not too far from Lehi. I might have to hunt that down at some point.
Yeah, it's good. Zulu Grill.
Zulu Grill. Okay. I think I've driven past there, actually. No, that sounds great. Well, and it's funny that you mentioned Olive Garden, because Olive Garden is one of those ones that I have become I've become a bit of a snob with Italian food. When I lived in Cleveland has like a proper Little Italy with some very good Italian restaurants. And so my wife and I, because when we first met, Olive Garden was like the pinnacle of our, like eating experiences, when you're a college student.
Right.
And so I've become a little bit of a snob, but I also there's part of me that still does kind of love like the almost like trashy Italian.
Yeah.
Olive Garden fettuccine Alfredo, what tasted good was like the cup of cream and the half a stick of butter.
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, it's just pure calories. I mean, it's cream and butter and carbohydrates. And it was just so divine.
Yeah. Again, when that hits the spot, it hits the spot so hard.
Yeah.
I love it. That was author and wargamer Robison Wells. Thanks again to Rob for coming on to chat. You can find Rob's social media down in the show notes. You can find me, as always, at brianmcclellan.com. As a quick reminder, jump onto Kickstarter to support my new Glass Immortals novella. Special thanks to James Soder for music and Tom Bishop for production. If you'd like to support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com/pagebreak or buy my books in ebook, paperback, or audio. You can also get signed copies of my books direct from my website or swag from my Redbubble store. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review. Special thanks to Elijah, Ivor Gullickson, James Clark, Jennifer Johnson, Jay Sunnell, Kyle Anderson, Sexton Hardcastle, and Talon for their backing on Patreon.